Housekeeper accused by millionaire went to trial alone until her son showed up and started. Hugging the housekeeper and saying she's innocent. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning sun cast long shadows through the towering windows of the Whitmore estate, its golden rays dancing across marble floors that had witnessed nearly 2 centuries of New York's elite. Maria Santos pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway, her weathered hands gripping the handle with practiced ease. At 45, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of countless battles fought and won through sheer determination. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and despite the early hour, her uniform was immaculate, a testament to the pride she took in her work. "Morning, Maria," called out James, the estate's head butler, his British accent still crisp after 30 years in America. He emerged from the breakfast room, adjusting his pristine white gloves. "Mrs. Whitmore wants the blue room prepared for her charity committee meeting this afternoon." "The usual setup," Maria nodded, offering him a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her brown eyes. "Of course, James. I'll make sure everything's perfect." Her voice carried a slight accent, remnants of her Puerto Rican heritage that she'd never quite lost and never wanted to. The blue room was Maria's favorite space in the mansion. Located on the 2nd floor, it overlooked the estate's meticulously maintained gardens, where jasmine vines climbed ancient oak trees, filling the air with their intoxicating fragrance. The room itself was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Pale blue silk wallpaper imported from France, crystal chandeliers that threw rainbow prisms across the ceiling, and antique furniture that had been in the Whitmore family for generations. As Maria dusted the ornate mantelpiece, she couldn't help but admire the family photographs displayed there. Richard Whitmore III, the current patriarch, stood tall and imposing in his latest business portrait, his steel-grey hair perfectly styled, his blue eyes sharp with the intelligence that had built his financial empire. Beside it sat a wedding photo of Richard and his wife, Victoria, taken 25 years ago. Victoria had been breathtaking then, with platinum blonde hair and emerald eyes that sparkled with life and ambition. Even now, approaching 50, she maintained that same ethereal beauty, though Maria had noticed how those green eyes sometimes held shadows of loneliness. The sound of heels clicking against marble interrupted her thoughts. Victoria Whitmore glided into the room, her morning ensemble, a cream-colored Chanel suit, perfectly coordinated with her pearl jewelry. Everything about Victoria screamed old money and refinement, from her practiced smile to the way she held her shoulders just so. "Maria, dear, how are you this morning?" Victoria's voice was warm, but carried that particular tone of practiced politeness that came with years of high society training. "Very well, Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for asking." Maria paused in her dusting, giving Victoria her full attention. It was something she'd learned early in her career. The wealthy appreciated being acknowledged, truly seen, even if just for a moment. "I wanted to speak with you about tonight's gala," Victoria continued, moving to the window and gazing out at the gardens. "We're expecting over 200 guests, and I know I can count on you to ensure everything runs smoothly upstairs. The private areas must remain absolutely pristine." Maria felt a familiar flutter of pride mixed with anxiety. The annual charity gala was the social event of the season, raising funds for underprivileged children, a cause that resonated deeply with Maria's own struggles as a single mother. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore, I'll coordinate with the catering staff to make sure the 2nd floor stays secured and spotless." "Wonderful." Victoria turned back to face her, and for a moment her polished facade slipped slightly. "Maria, I hope you know how much Richard and I appreciate everything you do. You're not just an employee here, you're part of what makes this house a home." The sincerity in Victoria's voice caught Maria off guard. In 2 years of working at the estate, she'd grown accustomed to polite distance from her employers. This moment of genuine warmth was unexpected and touching. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. That means more than you know." Maria's voice was thick with emotion. She thought of her 17-year-old son, Miguel, probably still asleep in their small apartment in Queens. Every day she worked here was another step towards securing his future. College tuition, a better life than the one she'd known. As Victoria left the room, Maria returned to her work with renewed purpose. She moved through the mansion with practiced efficiency, her keen eyes catching details that others missed. In the master bedroom, she noticed that Richard's prescription bottles had been moved, small things, but Maria's sharp intuition picked up on these inconsistencies. In the library, several first-edition books were slightly out of place, as if someone had been searching through them hastily. The afternoon flew by in a whirlwind of preparation. The mansion's staff, 12 full-time employees ranging from groundskeepers to personal assistants, worked with choreographed precision. Maria found herself naturally falling into a supervisory role, directing the younger maids and coordinating with the security team to ensure guest privacy. By evening, the Whitmore estate had been transformed into a glittering showcase. The grand ballroom sparkled with crystal and candlelight, while the gardens were illuminated with thousands of tiny white lights that made the jasmine blooms seem to glow. Distinguished guests arrived in luxury vehicles, their evening wear rivaling the red carpet at any Hollywood premiere. Maria stationed herself on the second floor, monitoring the private areas as requested. From her position at the top of the grand staircase, she had a perfect view of the festivities below. Victoria, resplendent in a midnight blue gown, mingled effortlessly with New York's most prominent philanthropists and business leaders. Richard, commanding in his tailored tuxedo, worked the room with the skill of a seasoned politician, his laughter booming above the elegant chamber music. Quite a show, isn't it? The voice belonged to Henry Castellanos, the estate's longtime gardener. At 72, Henry had tended these grounds for 4 decades, his weathered face telling the story of countless seasons spent nurturing the mansion's beauty. "It certainly is," Maria replied, adjusting a flower arrangement on a nearby table. "Mrs. Whitmore mentioned they're hoping to raise over $1 million tonight." Henry nodded slowly, his dark eyes scanning the crowd below with an expression Maria couldn't quite read. "These old walls have seen many nights like this," he said quietly. "Sometimes I wonder what stories they could tell." There was something in his tone that made Maria look at him more closely. Henry had always been kind to her, treating her with the respect and warmth that some of the other staff members still withheld. But tonight he seemed different, troubled, perhaps even worried. "Henry, is everything all right?" The old man was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head slightly. Just old memories, Mia. Pay no attention to an old fool." But as he walked away, Maria noticed his hands trembling slightly, and not from age. As the evening progressed, Maria made her regular rounds through the private quarters. The master bedroom remained undisturbed, as did the guest rooms and Richard's private study, a masculine retreat filled with leather-bound books and priceless artifacts from his family's extensive travels. It was in the study that Victoria kept her most precious possessions, including the jewelry collection that had belonged to her grandmother. The collection was legendary among New York's high society. Pieces dating back to the early 1900s, including a diamond tiara worn by European royalty, and a sapphire necklace that had graced the pages of Vogue decades before Victoria was born. Maria had only seen the jewelry once, during a previous charity event when Victoria had worn several pieces. The craftsmanship was breathtaking, each stone perfectly cut and set, representing not just monetary value, but generations of family history. Near midnight, as the last guests departed and the catering staff began their cleanup, Maria completed her final inspection of the second floor. Everything appeared to be in order. Linens fresh, surfaces spotless, security locks engaged. She gathered her supplies and made her way to the service elevator, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "Maria, wait." Victoria's voice echoed through the hallway. high and strained. Maria turned to see Victoria approaching rapidly, her evening gown rustling against the marble floor. The elegant composure that had marked her throughout the evening was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like panic. "Mrs. Whitmore? What's wrong?" Victoria's hands were shaking as she pressed them against her chest. "The jewelry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My grandmother's collection. It's gone." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. She set down her cleaning supplies and moved closer to Victoria, whose face had gone ashen despite her carefully applied makeup. "What do you mean, gone?" "I went to put away my necklace in the safe, and the entire collection," Victoria's voice broke. "Everything. The tiara, the sapphire set, the emerald bracelet my grandmother wore to her wedding, all of it just gone." Maria's mind raced through the evening's events. She had been on the second floor the entire time, monitoring access to the private areas. Only family members and senior staff had the security codes, and she hadn't seen anyone suspicious near the study. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you certain? Maybe Mr. Whitmore moved them for security reasons?" "Richard doesn't even know the combination to that safe," Victoria replied, tears now streaming down her cheeks, leaving dark tracks through her mascara. "Only I do. Only I." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. If only Victoria knew the combination, then whoever had taken the jewelry was either a master thief or had inside information. And Maria, who had spent the entire evening with unrestricted access to the private quarters, had just become the most obvious suspect. As if summoned by the crisis, Richard appeared at the end of the hallway, his face grim with the kind of controlled anger that comes from years of corporate boardroom battles. "Victoria, I've called the police and our security company. They'll be here within the hour." His steely gaze swept over Maria, and she felt a chill run down her spine. "I trust we can count on everyone's full cooperation with the investigation." The word "everyone" seemed to land squarely on Maria's shoulders, heavy with accusation and suspicion. Standing in that marble hallway, surrounded by generations of wealth and privilege, Maria Santos realized that her life was about to change forever. The trust she had built over 2 years, the reputation that had carried her through countless challenges, the stable future she had envisioned for her son, all of it now hung in the balance. As the sound of approaching sirens echoed through the night, Maria whispered a silent prayer and prepared to face whatever storm was coming. She had survived poverty, discrimination, and heartbreak before. Now she would need every ounce of that hard-won strength to navigate the treacherous waters ahead. The jasmine's sweet fragrance still drifted through the open windows, but it no longer smelled like paradise. Tonight, it carried the bitter scent of suspicion and the promise of a battle that would test everything Maria believed about justice, truth, and the power of an honest heart. The harsh fluorescent lights of the police station cast an unflattering pallor over everyone in the cramped interrogation room. Detective Sarah Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s with graying temples that spoke of too many late nights solving cases, sat across from Maria with a manila folder spread open between them. The folder contained security footage stills, witness statements, and what would soon become the foundation of Maria's nightmare. "Mrs. Santos, I need you to walk me through your evening one more time," Detective Martinez said, her pen poised over a yellow legal pad. Her tone was professional, but not unkind. She'd seen enough innocent people caught in bad circumstances to reserve judgment. "Start from when you arrived at work yesterday." Maria's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the styrofoam cup of bitter coffee someone had brought her hours ago. It was now cold, but she held on to it anyway, needing something to anchor her in this surreal moment. "I arrived at 7 a.m., same as always. I prepared the blue room for Mrs. Whitmore's committee meeting, then spent the afternoon coordinating preparations for the gala." "And you had access to all areas of the house during this time?" "Yes, but that's normal. I've been trusted with full access for 2 years now." Maria's voice caught slightly on the word trusted. Past tense already. Detective Martinez nodded and slid a black and white photograph across the table. This is from the security camera in the second-floor hallway, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. Can you identify the person in this image? Maria's stomach dropped as she looked at the grainy photograph. There she was, clear as day, carrying her cleaning supplies down the hallway that led directly to Richard's study. The angle made her look furtive, suspicious. Nothing like the dedicated employee she knew herself to be. That's me, but I was just doing my regular end-of-shift inspection. I check every room to make sure everything's secure before I leave. It's part of my job. According to the timestamp, you were in that hallway for approximately 12 minutes. What took so long? The question felt like a trap, though Maria couldn't articulate why. I was being thorough. With so many guests in the house, I wanted to make certain nothing was disturbed. I checked the master bedroom, the guest rooms, and yes, I walked past Mr. Whitmore's study to ensure the door was properly locked. Detective Martinez made a note, her expression unreadable. Did you enter the study? No, the door was closed and locked just as it should be. Mrs. Santos, I have to ask, are you experiencing any financial difficulties? The question hit Maria like a slap. She straightened in her chair, her dark eyes flashing with a mixture of hurt and indignation. I work 2 jobs to support my son. Yes, money is tight, but I would never ever steal from the Whitmores. They trusted me. The interrogation continued for another hour, each question chipping away at Maria's composure. When she finally emerged from the police station into the grey dawn light, she felt hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of her chest. The ride home to Queens in her aging Honda Civic gave her time to think, though her thoughts were a chaotic swirl of disbelief and growing dread. The neighborhoods gradually shifted from Manhattan's manicured elegance to the more authentic but weathered blocks where real people lived real lives. Her apartment building, a 6-story brick structure built in the 1960s, had never looked more welcoming. Miguel was waiting for her in their small kitchen, his tall frame hunched over a bowl of cereal. At 17, he was already taller than Maria, with her same dark eyes but his father's broader shoulders. His school backpack sat by the door, ready for another day at the public high school, where he maintained a 3.8 GPA despite working part-time at a local grocery store. "Mom? What happened? You look terrible." Maria sank into the chair across from him, suddenly feeling every one of her 45 years. "Mijo, we need to talk." As she explained the previous night's events, she watched Miguel's expression shift from confusion to disbelief, to something that made her heart ache. Doubt. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around his eyes, but Maria caught it immediately. "Mom, you didn't. I mean, of course you didn't, but what, Miguel?" He set down his spoon and looked at her directly. "How much was the jewelry worth?" "I don't know exactly. Hundreds of thousands, maybe more." Miguel was quiet for a long moment. "That would pay for college. For both of us." The words hung in the air between them like a poison cloud. Maria felt something break inside her chest, not just heartbreak, but a fundamental shift in the relationship that had been the bedrock of her existence. "Miguel José Santos," she said quietly, using his full name the way she had when he was small and in trouble. "Look at me." When his eyes met hers, she continued with fierce intensity. "I did not steal that jewelry. I would never steal anything from anyone. Do you understand me?" He nodded quickly, but the damage was done. If her own son could doubt her, how would the rest of the world react? Her phone rang before she could process this devastating realization further. The caller ID showed the Whitmore estate's number. "Maria, it's James." The butler's usually composed voice was strained. "I'm calling to inform you that Mr. Whitmore has decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect any personal items you may have left at the estate." The words were professional, but Maria could hear the discomfort in James's voice. They had worked together for 2 years, shared coffee breaks and stories about their families. Now he was delivering her professional death sentence. "James, I didn't do this." There was a long pause. "I know, Maria, I know. But Mr. Whitmore, he's under tremendous pressure. The insurance company is demanding answers, and Mrs. Whitmore is devastated. The jewelry belonged to her grandmother. It's all she has left of her family." After hanging up, Maria sat in her kitchen staring at the phone. 2 years of perfect service, of arriving early and staying late, of treating the Whitmore estate like her own home, all of it erased in a single night. The next few days passed in a blur of humiliation and desperation. The security escort to collect her few personal items from the estate was mortifying. 2 uniformed guards watched as she gathered her spare uniform, a small plant Miguel had given her for her desk, and a framed photo of him at his high school graduation. The other staff members she had considered friends couldn't meet her eyes. Victoria was nowhere to be seen, but Maria could feel the weight of surveillance from the mansion's windows as she walked to her car for the last time. The job search began immediately. Maria had worked as a housekeeper and cleaner for over 20 years, building a reputation for reliability and discretion. But word traveled fast in New York's domestic service network. When she called her employment agency, the response was politely devastating. "Maria, dear, I'm so sorry, but given the circumstances," Mrs. Patterson, the agency director, didn't need to finish the sentence. Perhaps in a few months, when things settled down, the rejection calls began to pile up. Families who had been interested in her services suddenly found other candidates. References who had once praised her work became unavailable for comment. It was as if a scarlet letter had been branded across her forehead, visible to every potential employer in the city. After a week of fruitless searching, Maria sat in her apartment calculating finances with growing panic. Her savings account, never robust to begin with, wouldn't last more than 2 months. Miguel's college applications were due soon, along with the associated fees she could no longer afford. The part-time evening job she'd taken cleaning office buildings barely covered groceries. "Mom, maybe you should get a lawyer," Miguel suggested one evening as they shared a dinner of rice and beans, a meal that was becoming distressingly frequent as their grocery budget tightened. "With what money?" "Mijo, do you know what lawyers cost?" That night, Maria lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom. Through the thin walls, she could hear her neighbor's television and the distant sound of traffic on Queens Boulevard. These familiar sounds, once comforting, now felt like the soundtrack to a life that was slowly collapsing around her. She thought about Victoria's tear-streaked face that night, the genuine anguish over losing her grandmother's jewelry. Despite her own situation, Maria felt a stab of sympathy. She understood the irreplaceable value of family heirlooms. They were connections to people and times that existed now only in memory. But sympathy wouldn't pay her rent or restore her reputation. As the days turned into weeks, Maria began to understand that this wasn't just about a theft investigation. This was about class, power, and the harsh reality that when the wealthy were wronged, someone had to pay, and it was usually someone who couldn't afford to fight back. The thought crystallized into something harder than desperation: determination. Maria Santos had survived an abusive marriage, raised a son alone, and clawed her way to respectability through sheer force of will. She had faced down poverty, discrimination, and heartbreak before. This would not be what finally broke her. If no one would believe in her innocence, she would prove it herself. If the system was designed to protect the wealthy at her expense, she would find another way to seek justice. The woman who had once been content to clean the shadows would step into the light and fight for her life. As she finally drifted off to sleep near dawn, Maria's last conscious thought was of Jasmine blooming in the Whitmore Gardens, beautiful, resilient, and stronger than anyone expected. 3 weeks after her termination, Maria found herself standing outside the Queen's Public Library, a manila envelope clutched in her weathered hands. Inside were photocopies of every document she could think of that might help her case. Employment records, character references, even receipts proving she had been home in Queens during previous charity events when she could have theoretically accessed the Whitmore safe. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The library's genealogy section had become her second home since losing her job. If she was going to prove her innocence, she needed to understand everything about the Whitmore family and their estate. What she had discovered in the past week had shaken her to her core. "You're back again," observed Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian who had been helping Maria navigate the historical archives. Her kind eyes crinkled behind wire-rimmed glasses as she approached the table where Maria had spread out decades-old property records and newspaper clippings. "I think I've found something important," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. She pointed to a yellow document dated 1952. "This is a property transfer record for the Whitmore estate. Look at the previous owner's name." Mrs. Chen adjusted her glasses and leaned closer. "Elena Santos Rivera," she read aloud, then looked up at Maria with surprise. "That's my grandmother's name." Maria's hands trembled as she touched the faded ink. "Mrs. Chen, my grandmother worked at that estate. She lived there in the servants' quarters for over 15 years. The discovery had come by accident. While researching the estate's history, hoping to find information about security systems or architectural details that might explain how someone else could have accessed the jewelry, Maria had stumbled across employment records from the 1940s and 1950s. Seeing her own surname had been shocking enough. But finding her grandmother's full name, complete with her maiden name Rivera, had left Maria speechless. "Did you know?" Mrs. Chen asked gently. Maria shook her head. "She died when I was 12. My mother never talked about her much, just said she worked for rich families in Manhattan. I had no idea it was the same house where I—" Her voice trailed off as the implications hit her. That evening, Maria called her mother in Puerto Rico, something she rarely did given the cost of long-distance calls and their strained relationship. Carmen Santos had never approved of Maria's life choices. The early marriage that ended badly, the decision to stay in New York, the struggles with poverty that Carmen viewed as evidence of poor decision-making. "Mami, I need to ask you about Abuela Elena." There was a long pause on the international line, filled with static and the weight of old secrets. "Why do you want to know about your grandmother now, Maria?" "Please, Mami, it's important. Did she work for a family called Whitmore?" Another pause, longer this time. When Carmen finally spoke, her voice was heavy with reluctance. "See, she worked for them. But that was long ago, mija. Why are you asking?" Maria explained the situation, the theft, her termination, the investigation. She could hear her mother's sharp intake of breath when she mentioned the Whitmore name. "Ay, Dios mío," Carmen whispered. "Maria, you need to stay away from that family." "What do you mean?" "Mommy, what aren't you telling me?" The story that emerged over the next hour shattered everything Maria thought she knew about her family's history. Elena Santos Rivera hadn't just been a housekeeper at the Whitmore estate. She had been the personal maid to Richard Whitmore II's wife, Margaret, and had been entrusted with the care of Margaret's most precious possessions, including her jewelry collection. "Your grandmother, she loved those jewels like they were her own children," Carmen said, her voice growing distant with memory. She would polish each piece, arrange them in their cases, even helped Margaret choose what to wear for important events. But then what? Margaret died suddenly. Heart attack, they said. Your grandmother found her. And then, just days after the funeral, the Whitmores accused Elena of stealing jewelry from Margaret's collection. Maria felt the blood drain from her face. The parallel was too precise, too cruel to be coincidence. What happened to her? They fired her, of course. No references, no severance pay. She came back to Puerto Rico with nothing but the clothes on her back and stories about how the jewelry had been in her own family before the Whitmores ever owned it. "What do you mean?" Carmen sighed deeply. Elena's mother, your great-grandmother Isabel, she worked for a Spanish family in San Juan. Very wealthy, very old. When they left the island during the Spanish-American War, Isabel helped them pack their belongings. Some jewelry went missing during the chaos, and years later, pieces matching those descriptions started appearing in New York collections. The room seemed to spin around Maria as she processed this information. Are you saying the Whitmore jewelry originally belonged to our family? I'm saying your great-grandmother always claimed it did. But who would believe a Puerto Rican servant over a wealthy American family? Elena spent the rest of her life believing she'd been robbed twice, once of her family's heritage, and once of her reputation. After hanging up, Maria sat in her small kitchen, staring at the wall where Miguel's school awards hung in simple frames. The injustice of it was breathtaking. 3 generations of Santos women, all connected to the same jewelry collection, all accused of the same crime. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Maria opened her apartment door to find Victoria Whitmore standing in the hallway, looking completely out of place in her designer coat and heels among the scuffed walls and fluorescent lighting. Mrs. Whitmore. Maria was too shocked to say anything else. May I come in? I'd like to talk to you. Victoria's presence in Maria's modest apartment was surreal. She perched carefully on the edge of Maria's second-hand sofa, her manicured hands folded in her lap, while Maria prepared coffee with shaking hands. I know what you must think of me, Victoria began when Maria sat across from her. Coming here after what's happened. I think you're a woman who lost something precious to her, Maria replied carefully. I understand that pain. Victoria's composed facade cracked slightly. The insurance company is pushing for criminal charges. They say the evidence is circumstantial but compelling. Richard he's under tremendous pressure from the board of directors. The scandal is affecting the company's stock price. And you? What do you think? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying Maria's face with those sharp green eyes. I've spent 2 weeks thinking about that night, going over every detail, every conversation. Do you know what I keep coming back to? Maria shook her head. The way you looked at those photographs in the blue room, the respect in your eyes when you handled my grandmother's things, the genuine care you showed for our home. Victoria leaned forward slightly. I don't think someone capable of that level of authentic care could also be capable of such a calculated betrayal. The words brought tears to Maria's eyes. Then why haven't you said anything to your husband? Because I have no proof. And because, Victoria hesitated, then continued with obvious difficulty. Because Richard has been acting strangely since the theft. Secretive phone calls, meetings with people I don't recognize. I'm starting to wonder if there are things about this situation that I don't understand. Maria made a decision that would have seemed impossible just minutes earlier. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to tell you something about your grandmother's jewelry collection. Over the next hour, Maria shared everything she had learned about her family's connection to the estate, the parallel accusations against her grandmother, and the possibility that the jewelry's ownership had a more complicated history than anyone realized. Victoria listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each revelation. When Maria finished, Victoria sat in stunned silence for several minutes. If this is true, Victoria finally whispered, then my family has been living a lie for 70 years. I don't know if it's true, Maria admitted. I only know what my mother told me and what I found in the historical records. But Mrs. Whitmore, don't you think it's strange that the same accusation would be made against 2 generations of Santos women, both working with the same jewelry collection? Victoria stood abruptly, pacing to the small window that overlooked the parking lot. Maria, if what you're suggesting is correct, then someone wanted you to be blamed for this theft, specifically. Someone who knew about your grandmother's history with my family. The implication hung heavy in the air between them. If the theft had been orchestrated to frame Maria, then someone with knowledge of both families' histories was involved. Someone who had access to the estate, knew about the security systems, and understood exactly how to make Maria look guilty. "Who else knows about your grandmother's connection to our family?" Victoria asked. "I didn't know myself until a few days ago. But if the employment records exist in the library, they might exist in other places too." Victoria turned from the window, her expression determined. "Maria, I want to help you prove your innocence, but I need to know. Are you prepared for what we might discover? If we dig deep enough into this mystery, we might uncover truths that neither of our families is prepared to face." Maria thought of Miguel, probably at school at this very moment, trying to concentrate on his studies while carrying the burden of his mother's disgrace. She thought of her grandmother Elena, dying in Puerto Rico with her reputation forever stained by accusations she couldn't fight. She thought of the jasmine gardens at the Whitmore estate, beautiful but built on soil that might be hiding decades of injustice. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've lost everything I worked for, and my son is starting to doubt the woman who raised him. I'm prepared for whatever truth we find, because it can't be worse than this lie I'm living now." Victoria nodded slowly, and Maria saw something shift in her expression, the emergence of a steel backbone that had been hidden beneath years of polished society manners. "Then we're going to find out who really stole my grandmother's jewelry," Victoria said. "And we're going to make sure they pay for what they've done to both our families." As Victoria prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Maria, there's something else. The night of the gala, I saw Henry in the gardens much later than usual. He was digging near the jasmine beds, which struck me as odd, since he usually does that work during the day." The seed of an idea began to form in Maria's mind. Henry, with his 40 years at the estate, would know every secret passage, every hidden corner, every piece of family history. He had also seemed troubled that night, his hands shaking with more than age. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think it's time we had a conversation with Henry about what he really knows about that night, and about what he might remember about my grandmother." The morning mist clung to the jasmine vines like ghostly fingers as Maria and Victoria approached the Whitmore estate through the service entrance. It had been Victoria's idea to meet Henry before the other staff arrived, a clandestine conversation that felt both necessary and dangerous. Maria's heart pounded as they walked the familiar gravel path toward the gardener's shed, every step bringing back memories of the life that had been stripped away from her. Henry Castellanos was already at work among his beloved plants, his weathered hands gentle as he pruned dead blooms from a rosebush. At 72, he moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been shaped by decades of honest labor. His thick gray hair was hidden beneath a well-worn baseball cap, and his brown skin bore the map of countless hours under the sun. "Senora Whitmore," he said with surprise, straightening slowly as he noticed their approach. His dark eyes flickered to Maria with something that might have been guilt. "I wasn't expecting you this early." "Henry, we need to talk," Victoria said, her voice carrying an authority that Maria had rarely heard before. "About the night of the gala." "But what you know." The old man's shoulders sagged slightly, and he set down his pruning shears with hands that trembled more than they had the night everything changed. "I was wondering when this conversation would come. You were in the gardens very late that night," Victoria continued. "I saw you from my bedroom window, working near the jasmine beds. What were you doing?" Henry removed his cap and ran his fingers through his hair, a gesture that spoke of deep internal struggle. "Senora, there are some secrets that have been buried in this soil for a very long time. Maybe it's time they saw the light." He led them to a weathered wooden bench beneath an ancient oak tree, the same tree where Maria had often taken her breaks during her 2 years at the estate. The irony wasn't lost on her. Sitting in the place where she had once felt most at peace, now desperate for answers that might save her future. "Maria," Henry said, finally meeting her eyes directly. "Your grandmother Elena was a good woman, one of the best people I ever knew." Maria's breath caught. You knew my grandmother? I was just a boy then, maybe 15 years old. My father was the head gardener before me, and Elena. She was kind to the groundskeeping staff when others treated us like we were invisible. She would bring us lemonade on hot days, bandages when we were hurt. She had a gentle heart. Victoria leaned forward, her designer clothes an odd contrast to the garden setting. Henry, what really happened when Margaret Whitmore died? The old man was quiet for so long that Maria began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of decades-old guilt. Margaret Whitmore was not a happy woman, he began slowly. Beautiful, yes, but trapped in a marriage that was more about business than love. She spent hours in these gardens, telling Elena stories about her childhood, about dreams she'd given up. Elena became more than a maid to her. She was her confidant, maybe her only real friend. "What does this have to do with the jewelry?" Victoria asked, though her voice had lost its edge. Margaret knew she was sick. Heart problems, the doctor said. She also knew that when she died, her husband would remarry quickly. He needed a wife for social appearances. She was terrified that her memory, her personal belongings, everything that made her who she was, would be erased. Henry stood and walked to the jasmine vines, touching the delicate flowers with reverence. One night, maybe a week before she died, Margaret came to my father in great distress. She had discovered something in her husband's study, papers showing that some of her jewelry collection had been acquired through questionable means during his father's business dealings in the Caribbean. Maria's heart began to race. What kind of questionable means? The kind where wealthy Americans took advantage of political upheaval to buy precious items from desperate families for far less than their worth, or sometimes to claim items that had been abandoned during the chaos and declare them legally obtained. Victoria's face had gone pale. "Are you saying my great-grandfather stole jewelry from Puerto Rican families?" "I'm saying that some of what Margaret considered her inheritance had originally belonged to other people. People who had no power to reclaim what was theirs." Henry's voice grew stronger, as if the telling was giving him courage. Margaret was horrified. She decided to return certain pieces to their rightful families, starting with a collection that had belonged to the Rivera family from San Juan. The name hit Maria like a physical blow. Rivera, her great-grandmother's family name. Did she succeed? She was planning to. The night before she died, Margaret gave Elena a small velvet bag containing 3 pieces from the collection, a sapphire necklace, a diamond bracelet, and a pair of emerald earrings. She told Elena to find the Rivera family and return what had been taken from them. "But Margaret died that night," Victoria whispered. She did, and in the chaos that followed, with funeral preparations and grief, Elena held on to those pieces, waiting for the right moment to fulfill Margaret's wishes. But then Richard II discovered they were missing from the collection. Maria felt sick. So when he accused my grandmother of theft. She was innocent of stealing, but she couldn't defend herself without betraying Margaret's final wishes and exposing the family's secrets. She chose to protect Margaret's memory and accept the consequences. The 3 sat in stunned silence as the full weight of this revelation settled over them. The morning sun had burned off the mist, revealing the gardens in all their meticulously maintained beauty, beauty built on a foundation of buried injustice. "Henry," Victoria finally said, her voice barely audible, "what happened to those 3 pieces of jewelry?" The old man's eyes filled with tears. "Elena took them back to Puerto Rico. She spent years trying to track down surviving members of the Rivera family, but the records had been destroyed during various hurricanes and political changes. When she died, she passed them on to her daughter, Maria's mother, along with the true story of how they came to be in her possession." Maria's mind reeled as connections formed and reformed in her consciousness. "The missing jewelry from last month, was it the same pieces?" "Some of them, yes. The sapphire necklace and emerald earrings are part of the current collection. The diamond bracelet was sold years ago when the family needed money. Victoria stood abruptly, beginning to pace among the flower beds. This is insane. You're telling me that my grandmother's jewelry collection contains stolen goods, that my great-grandfather was essentially a thief, and that Elena Santos was framed for trying to return stolen property to its rightful owners. I'm telling you the truth that I've carried for 40 years, Henry replied firmly. And I'm telling you that someone else knows this story, because the theft last month was too precise, too calculated. Whoever took that jewelry knew exactly which pieces to target. Maria felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warming sun. Who else could know? There were others who worked at the estate during Elena's time. James's predecessor knew some of it. Butlers hear everything. There might be family documents, letters, records that Richard II kept, and Henry hesitated. And what? Victoria demanded. And your husband has been asking me questions about the gardens lately, specifically about areas where things might have been buried for safekeeping during the 1950s. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Victoria's face cycled through emotions, disbelief, horror, and finally a cold anger that transformed her features into something Maria had never seen before. You think Richard knows about this? You think my own husband might be involved in framing Maria? I think, Henry said carefully, that there are financial pressures on your family that you might not be aware of. I think someone discovered the true history of that jewelry collection and decided to use it for their own purposes. And I think Maria was chosen as the scapegoat because of her family connection. It would seem like poetic justice to anyone who knew the old story. Maria stood on shaking legs, her mind working furiously through the implications. If Richard orchestrated this theft, he would need help. Someone with access to the house, someone who knew the security systems, someone who could plant evidence and manipulate the investigation. The security footage, Victoria said suddenly. Richard was the one who reviewed it first, before the police arrived. He could have edited it, selected which segments to preserve. And the insurance investigation, Maria added, pieces falling into place. He would profit from the claim while simultaneously destroying my reputation and eliminating someone who might stumble onto the truth about the jewelry's origins. Henry nodded grimly. There's something else. The night of the gala, I wasn't just working in the gardens. I was burying something Richard asked me to hide. A metal box containing papers he said were important family documents that needed to be kept safe. But I saw enough to know they were insurance papers and financial records. Where? Victoria's voice was sharp as a blade. Near the jasmine beds where your grandmother used to sit. About 3 feet down, wrapped in waterproof material. Victoria turned to Maria with an expression of fierce determination. We're going to dig up that box, and then we're going to find the evidence we need to prove what really happened. As they walked toward the gardener's tool shed to gather shovels, Maria felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't just a victim struggling to prove her innocence. She was a woman uncovering a multi-generational injustice, armed with allies who shared her hunger for truth. The jasmine blooms released their intoxicating fragrance as they passed, but now the scent carried a different meaning. These flowers had witnessed decades of secrets growing in soil that held both literal and metaphorical buried truths. Today, finally, some of those truths would see the light. Maria, Victoria said as they reached the shed, I want you to know that regardless of what we find, I believe you. And I'm going to make sure everyone else believes you too. For the first time since this nightmare began, Maria allowed herself to hope that justice might be possible, not just for herself, but for her grandmother Elena, and for all the other powerless people whose stories had been buried beneath the beautiful surface of wealth and privilege. The metal box emerged from the earth like a confession, finally ready to be heard. Victoria's designer clothes were streaked with dirt, her manicured nails broken from clawing at the packed soil around the jasmine roots. Maria's hands were steadier as they worked together, muscle memory from years of physical labor serving her well. Henry stood watch, his weathered face etched with the tension of a man about to see decades-old secrets exposed. "It's heavier than I expected." Victoria panted as they lifted the waterproof container from its makeshift grave. The morning sun caught the condensation on its surface, making it gleam like buried treasure. Inside the gardener's shed, surrounded by the familiar scents of fertilizer and old wood, they carefully opened the box. The papers inside were meticulously organized in manila folders, each labeled in Richard's precise handwriting. What they revealed painted a picture of financial desperation, disguised behind a facade of continued wealth. "Jesus Christ," Victoria whispered, staring at a stack of overdue loan notices. "Richard owes $12 million to private lenders. When did this happen?" Maria looked over her shoulder at documents showing failed investments, margin calls, and increasingly desperate attempts to maintain liquidity. "Look at the dates. This has been building for over 2 years. The most damning evidence was in a folder marked Insurance Strategies. It contained detailed documentation of the jewelry collection's appraised value, correspondence with insurance adjusters, and a handwritten note in Richard's distinctive script. Claim must be filed within 30 days of theft. Total payout estimated at $2.8 million. Replacement pieces already sourced from Amsterdam dealer cost $180,000. He was planning to steal his own jewelry and replace it with replicas, Victoria said, her voice hollow with disbelief. And he was going to collect nearly $3 million in insurance money. Henry picked up another document, a private investigator's report on Maria's background. "Look at this. He had you investigated weeks before the gala. He knew about your grandmother's connection to the estate." The report was thorough and invasive, detailing Maria's work history, financial struggles, and family background. Someone had even interviewed former employers and neighbors, painting a picture of a hard-working but financially desperate single mother. The perfect scapegoat for a wealthy man's insurance fraud. Maria felt violated reading the clinical assessment of her life reduced to bullet points and risk factors. But beneath the hurt was a growing rage, not just at the betrayal, but at the calculated cruelty of choosing her specifically because of her family's tragic history with the Whitmores. "There's more," Victoria said, pulling out a folder labeled Historical Research. Inside were photocopies of the same library documents Maria had found, along with additional records that painted an even clearer picture of the jewelry's disputed ownership. One document made Victoria gasp audibly, a letter from her great-grandfather to a business associate, dated 1898, discussing the acquisition of valuable assets from displaced families during the political transition in Puerto Rico. The language was euphemistic, but the meaning was clear. He had taken advantage of desperate people to build his collection. "My family built their reputation on stolen goods," Victoria said quietly. "And when someone tried to return them to their rightful owners, we destroyed her life to cover it up." "And now history is repeating itself," Maria added bitterly. "Except this time, your husband is stealing from his own family and using me to cover his tracks." Henry had been silent throughout their discoveries, but now he spoke with quiet authority. "There's something else you need to know. Richard has been meeting with Tony Marcelli." The name made Victoria's blood run cold. Tony Marcelli was notorious in certain New York circles. Not quite organized crime, but close enough to make respectable people nervous. He specialized in high-end insurance fraud, money laundering, and other financial crimes that targeted the wealthy's assets. "How do you know this?" Victoria demanded. "Because Marcelli has been coming to the estate late at night, after the staff goes home. I've been staying late to tend to the greenhouse, and I've seen his car in the service drive 3 times in the past month." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Maria. The replica jewelry. Marcelli would have the connections to commission perfect replicas and arrange for the originals to be sold, on the black market. Richard gets his insurance money, Marcelli gets his cut from selling the real pieces, and I get blamed for the whole thing." Victoria stood abruptly, the force of her movement sending papers scattering across the shed's workbench. "We have to call the police. This evidence proves Richard orchestrated the entire theft." "Wait," Maria said, grabbing Victoria's arm. "If we call the police now, Richard will claim we planted this evidence. He's had weeks to establish his version of events, and we just dug this up from his property without permission. Any lawyer could get this thrown out of court. Then what do you suggest?" Maria's mind was working furiously, shaped by years of navigating systems designed to work against people like her. "We need more than documents. We need Richard to confess, or we need to catch him in the act of something incriminating." Henry nodded slowly. "The insurance adjuster is coming tomorrow for the final assessment. Richard thinks he's in the clear. The police have closed their investigation, and he's expecting the insurance payout within the week. What if we could make him think something had gone wrong with his plan?" Victoria asked. "What if we could make him panic and reach out to Marcelli?" An idea began forming in Maria's mind, dangerous but potentially decisive. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you still have access to your husband's study?" "Of course. Why?" "Because we're going to leave him a message that will make him think his perfect crime is falling apart." They spent the next hour crafting their strategy. Victoria would return to the mansion and act normally, waiting for Richard to leave for his afternoon meetings. Maria would slip into the house through the service entrance, risky, given that she was supposed to be banned from the property, but Henry assured them that most of the staff would be occupied with lunch preparations. The plan was for Maria to plant a carefully crafted note in Richard's study, designed to look like it came from someone who knew about his scheme and was demanding a larger cut of the insurance money. The note would suggest that the original plan was being threatened by new evidence, forcing Richard to contact his co-conspirators to manage the crisis. "This is insane," Victoria said as they prepared to separate. "If you're caught on the property, Richard will have you arrested for trespassing." "I've been treated like a criminal for weeks," Maria replied with grim determination. "At least this time, I'll be doing something that might actually clear my name." As they prepared to implement their plan, Henry pulled Maria aside. "Mija, there's something I need to give you." He reached into his tool shed and withdrew a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, were 3 pieces of jewelry that took Maria's breath away. The sapphire necklace caught the light like captured starlight. The emerald earrings glowed with inner fire. And even though the diamond bracelet was missing, the remaining pieces were unmistakably valuable and beautiful. "These belong to your great-grandmother," Henry said quietly. "Elena gave them to my father for safekeeping when she returned to Puerto Rico. She said that someday, when the time was right, they should be returned to where they belonged." Maria's hands trembled as she held the jewelry. These weren't just valuable objects. They were her family's stolen heritage, carried across generations of women who had fought to preserve them despite impossible odds. "Henry, I can't take these. If someone sees me with them, the time for hiding is over," he said firmly. "Your great-grandmother's jewelry should be with her great-granddaughter. And maybe, when this is all finished, they can finally rest in peace." As Maria slipped the jewelry into her jacket pocket, she felt the weight of more than precious stones. She carried the hopes of 3 generations of Santos women, the burden of injustices that had echoed across decades, and the responsibility to finally set the record straight. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees as they finalized their preparations. Victoria would create a distraction to ensure Richard's absence from the house. Henry would monitor the grounds to warn of any unexpected returns. And Maria would slip into the mansion that had once been her workplace, now transformed into the stage for a confrontation that would determine whether justice or wealth would ultimately prevail. "Whatever happens," Victoria said as they prepared to part ways, "I want you to know that I believe in you, and I'm going to make sure the world knows the truth about what my family did to yours." Maria nodded, touching the jewelry in her pocket one final time. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're going to finish what my grandmother started. We're going to make sure the truth finally comes to light." As she walked toward the mansion's service entrance, Maria felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders. The jasmine vines climbing the garden walls released their fragrance into the afternoon air. No longer the scent of beauty hiding secrets, but the perfume of truth preparing to bloom. The familiar hallways of the Whitmore estate felt alien and menacing as Maria moved through them like a ghost returning to haunt the living. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet seemed amplified in the afternoon silence, every shadow a potential witness to her unauthorized presence. The marble floors that had once reflected her pride in honest work now gleamed like ice beneath her careful steps. Richard's study door stood slightly ajar, exactly as Victoria had promised. Through the gap, Maria could see the leather-bound books and mahogany furniture that had always intimidated her during her employment. Now, armed with knowledge of Richard's desperation and criminality, the room's opulence felt like a costume worn by a desperate actor. She slipped inside and moved quickly to the massive desk where Richard conducted his business. The surface was meticulously organized. Fountain pens arranged in perfect lines, documents stacked with mathematical precision. This was the workspace of a man who believed he could control every variable in his life, including the destruction of an innocent woman's reputation. The note Maria placed in the center of the desk was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, crafted to exploit Richard's growing paranoia. "Mr. Whitmore, the arrangement we discussed is becoming complicated. New evidence has surfaced that could expose our entire operation. The Santos woman is not as isolated as we believed. We need to meet tonight to discuss damage control. The usual place, 10 p.m. Come alone and bring the additional payment we discussed. TM." The initials would be enough to identify Tony Marcelli to Richard, while the vague references to new evidence and additional payment were designed to trigger panic. If their theory was correct, Richard would immediately contact Marcelli to verify the message, giving them the phone records they needed to prove collusion. As Maria prepared to leave the study, she heard the unmistakable sound of the front door opening and Richard's voice echoing through the entrance hall. Her blood turned to ice. Victoria had promised he would be in meetings until evening. "James, have the financial documents I requested been prepared?" Richard's voice carried the authoritative tone of a man accustomed to immediate compliance. "Yes, sir." "They're on your desk in the study," came James's measured reply. Maria's mind raced through her options. The study had no other exit, and Richard's footsteps were already approaching down the hallway. In desperation, she looked around the room and spotted the tall grandfather clock in the corner, the same one that Victoria had mentioned during one of their conversations about the estate's hidden passages. Her fingers found the concealed latch behind the clock's pendulum, just as Richard's hand touched the study door. The narrow passage that opened behind the timepiece was musty and dark, clearly unused for decades, but it was her only escape route. She squeezed into the cramped space just as Richard entered his study, pulling the hidden door closed behind her with millimeters to spare. Through a gap in the old woodwork, she could see Richard moving toward his desk, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, but unable to hide the tension in his shoulders. "What the hell?" Richard's voice was sharp with alarm as he spotted the note. Maria watched as he read it twice, his face cycling through confusion, fear, and finally, cold calculation. He reached for his cell phone with hands that shook slightly, the first crack in his composed facade that Maria had ever witnessed. The conversation that followed confirmed their worst suspicions. "Tony, it's Richard. Did you leave a message on my desk?" There was a pause, then Richard's voice grew urgent. "What do you mean you haven't been to the house today? Someone left a note signed with your initials." Maria could only hear Richard's side of the conversation, but his responses painted a clear picture of Marcelli's involvement in the scheme. "No, The insurance money hasn't been released yet. The adjuster is coming tomorrow for the final assessment. Another pause. I don't know who could have written this. You're the only person who knows the details of our arrangement. The next part of the conversation made Maria's blood run cold. What do you mean someone's been asking questions about me? Who? Richard's voice rose in pitch. A woman? Describe her. Maria pressed closer to the gap in the wall, her heart pounding, as she realized they were talking about her investigation into the jewelry's history. That's impossible. Maria Santos was fired weeks ago. She has no resources to investigate anything. But even as he said it, Richard's voice carried a note of uncertainty. Yes, I understand the risks, but we've come too far to back out now. The insurance payout is nearly $3 million, enough to cover my debts and leave us both comfortable. Richard began pacing behind his desk, his agitation growing. Look, meet me tonight at the warehouse. We need to discuss contingency plans in case this situation escalates. After ending the call, Richard stood motionless for several minutes, staring at the note on his desk. When he finally moved, it was to open a locked drawer and withdraw a small recording device. Maria watched in fascination as he rewound the tape and began to listen to what sounded like phone conversations. Insurance adjuster tomorrow at 2 p.m., came a woman's voice from the device. Final assessment should approve full payout within 48 hours. Maria realized with shock that Richard had been recording phone conversations with the insurance company, probably to ensure he had documentation of their promises in case something went wrong. But the next voice on the recording made her gasp audibly. Richard, I'm worried about Maria. She's been asking questions about the family history, visiting the library, researching property records. It was Victoria's voice, captured without her knowledge during what she must have thought was a private conversation with her husband. Let her dig, Richard's recorded voice replied. The deeper she digs, the more suspicious she looks. A desperate woman investigating her employers after being fired for theft. It just reinforces the narrative that she's guilty. The callousness in his voice was breathtaking. Not only had Richard orchestrated Maria's downfall, but he had manipulated his own wife's concern for an innocent woman to further his scheme. Richard fast-forwarded through more recordings until he found another conversation that made Maria's stomach turn. The Santos woman's son has been asking his classmates about lawyers. Came an unfamiliar voice. Apparently he's trying to find someone who'll take his mother's case pro bono. Miguel, Maria whispered to herself, her heart breaking as she realized that even her son's efforts to help her had been monitored. Good, Richard's voice responded on the recording. Let him try. No respectable lawyer will touch a case with this little evidence and this much negative publicity. It will just drain their savings faster. The recordings continued for another few minutes, revealing the extent of Richard's surveillance network and his complete lack of remorse for destroying Maria's life. When he finally turned off the device and locked it back in the drawer, Maria had heard enough to understand the true scope of his cruelty. But she had also heard something that gave her hope. Richard was meeting Marcelli tonight at a warehouse, presumably to discuss their next moves and possibly to split the insurance money once it was paid. If she and Victoria could record that meeting, they would have the evidence needed to expose the entire conspiracy. Richard left the study 20 minutes later, taking the mysterious note with him. Maria waited another 10 minutes before emerging from her hiding place, her legs cramped from crouching in the narrow passage. The grandfather clock mechanism had left its scent on her clothes, old wood and brass polish that reminded her of her grandmother's stories about the estate's hidden secrets. She made her way through the mansion service corridors, using routes she had memorized during her 2 years of employment. The familiarity was both comforting and heartbreaking. These hallways had once represented stability and honest work, but now they felt like the corridors of a prison she was escaping. Victoria was waiting in the gardens, pacing among the jasmine vines with barely contained anxiety. When she saw Maria emerge from the service entrance, she rushed forward with desperate urgency. "Thank God you're safe." Richard came back early from his meetings. "I was terrified he'd caught you." "He almost did," Maria replied, then quickly recounted everything she had overheard. Victoria's face grew paler with each revelation, particularly when Maria described the recordings of their private conversations. "He's been spying on me," Victoria whispered, her voice thick with betrayal. "Recording my phone calls, monitoring my conversations. My own husband has been treating me like an enemy." "Mrs. Whitmore, we have one chance to catch him in the act. Tonight at the warehouse meeting with Marcelli. If we can record their conversation, we'll have proof of the conspiracy," Victoria finished. "But how do we find this warehouse? And how do we get close enough to record without being seen?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Henry had been listening from nearby, and he stepped forward with grim determination. "I know where they meet," he said quietly. "There's an old storage facility on the waterfront in Queens. Richard's been paying me to maintain a building there for business purposes. I thought it was legitimate. But now we know it's where he stores stolen goods and meets with criminals," Maria said bitterly. Victoria straightened her shoulders, and Maria saw the same steel backbone that had emerged during their previous confrontations with the truth. "Then we're going to that warehouse tonight, and we're going to get the evidence we need to destroy Richard's lies once and for all." As the afternoon sun began to set over the estate's gardens, casting long shadows across the jasmine beds where they had unearthed the first pieces of evidence, Maria felt the momentum of justice finally building in their favor. Tonight would determine whether Richard's elaborate deception would succeed or whether 3 generations of Santos women would finally receive the vindication they deserved. The sweet scent of jasmine filled the evening air, but tonight it smelled like victory waiting to bloom. The industrial district of Queens looked like a graveyard of broken dreams in the pale moonlight. Abandoned warehouses lined the waterfront like sleeping giants, their broken windows staring blindly across the East River toward Manhattan's glittering skyline. Maria crouched behind a rusted shipping container, her heart hammering against her ribs as she checked her watch. 9:47 p.m. Richard and Marcelli would arrive soon for their clandestine meeting. Victoria knelt beside her, looking absurdly out of place in her designer jeans and cashmere sweater among the industrial decay. Her blonde hair was hidden beneath a dark baseball cap, and her manicured hands gripped a small digital recorder with white-knuckled intensity. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Victoria whispered, her breath visible in the cold October air. "It has to," Maria replied grimly. She thought of Miguel, probably doing homework at their kitchen table right now, still carrying the weight of doubt about his mother's innocence. "This is our only chance to prove what really happened." Henry had positioned himself across the loading dock, hidden behind a stack of abandoned pallets, with a clear view of the warehouse entrance. At his age, he shouldn't be involved in something this dangerous. But he'd insisted on helping, partly from guilt over his decades of silence, and partly from genuine affection for Maria and determination to see justice done. The warehouse Richard used for his meetings was a 3-story brick building, dating from the 1940s. Its legitimate business had died years ago, leaving it perfect for the kind of activities that required privacy and discretion. Henry had provided them with a rough layout, a main floor with loading docks, a second floor that had once housed offices, and a basement used for storage. The sound of car engines broke the night's silence. 2 vehicles approached from different directions, Richard's silver Mercedes sedan and a black SUV with tinted windows that screamed organized crime connections. Maria felt her mouth go dry as the vehicles parked near the warehouse's main entrance. Richard emerged from his car, looking nervous but determined, his expensive overcoat doing little to hide the tension in his posture. The man who got out of the SUV was everything Maria had expected Tony Marcelli to be, thick-set and dangerous, with the kind of casual menace that came from years of intimidating people for a living. "You're late?" Marcelli's voice carried clearly across the empty lot, his Brooklyn accent thick with irritation. "I had to make sure I wasn't followed," Richard replied, his cultured Manhattan tone sounding almost comical next to Marcelli's street-hardened speech. "That note you left in my study today spooked me." "What note?" "I told you on the phone I didn't leave any fucking note." Maria and Victoria exchanged glances. Their psychological trap was working perfectly. Richard's paranoia was making him reveal details about their arrangement without Marcelli having to prompt him. The two men entered the warehouse, leaving Maria and Victoria to make their dangerous approach. They had rehearsed this moment, but the reality of sneaking into a building where criminals were conducting business made Maria's hands shake as she checked the recording equipment. One final time, the warehouse's side entrance was secured with a chain and padlock, but years of weather had weakened the doorframe. With some careful maneuvering, they managed to slip inside through a gap that Henry had identified during his reconnaissance visits. The interior was a maze of shadows and abandoned equipment. Moonlight filtered through dirty skylights, creating patches of dim illumination among the deeper darkness. Maria led the way, her experience cleaning large buildings, giving her an advantage in navigating unfamiliar spaces quietly. They could hear voices from the main floor, echoing off the high ceiling and brick walls. Moving carefully up a metal staircase to what had once been the building's administrative offices, they found a perfect vantage point, overlooking the main floor through windows that had lost their glass decades ago. Below them, Richard and Marcelli stood near a card table illuminated by a single battery-powered lantern. The dramatic lighting made them look like actors in a noir film, except the crimes they were discussing were devastatingly real. "The insurance adjuster comes tomorrow," Richard was saying, pulling papers from a briefcase. "Final assessment, then payment within 48 hours. 2.8 million, just like we planned. And the Santos woman." Marcelli's voice was casual, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the destruction of an innocent person's life. "Completely neutralized. The police have closed their investigation. She can't find work anywhere in the city, and she doesn't have the resources to mount any kind of legal challenge." Richard's voice carried a note of satisfaction that made Maria feel sick. "You sure about that?" "Because I've been hearing things. Word on the street is that she's been digging into your family's history, asking questions about old jewelry collections." Richard's confident posture faltered slightly. "That's impossible. She's a housekeeper from Queens with a high school education. What could she possibly uncover? Maybe nothing. But smart money says you eliminate potential problems before they become actual problems." Marcelli's tone carried an unmistakable threat. "You want my advice? Make sure the Santos woman stops asking questions permanently." The words hit Maria like ice water. They weren't just talking about framing her for theft, they were discussing silencing her completely. Victoria grabbed Maria's arm, her eyes wide with terror. Through the broken window, they could see Richard considering Marcelli's suggestion with the cold calculation of a businessman weighing options. "That might be excessive," Richard said finally. "The situation is under control, is it? Then explain the note that mysteriously appeared on your desk today. Someone knows about our arrangement, Whitmore. Someone who has access to your house and knows details about our operation." Richard began pacing, his agitation growing. "I've been thinking about that. Only a few people knew enough to write that note. My wife has been acting strangely lately, asking questions about the jewelry, showing unexpected concern for the Santos woman." "You think your wife is the leak?" "I think my wife has been manipulated by someone who knows more than they should." Richard stopped pacing and turned to face Marcelli directly. "There are family secrets, old documents that could complicate things if they came to light. Things about how my great-grandfather acquired that jewelry collection. What kind of complications?" Richard pulled out a folder Maria recognized from their morning discovery. The kind where it turns out some of the jewelry was never legally mine to begin with. My great-grandfather bought pieces from desperate Puerto Rican families during political upheaval in the 1890s, paid practically nothing for items worth fortunes. So, that was over a century ago. So the Santos woman's great-grandmother was one of those families. Elena Santos worked for my grandfather and knew the truth about the jewelry's origins. When she tried to return stolen pieces to their rightful owners, my grandfather framed her for theft and destroyed her life. Marcelli whistled low. History repeating itself. Poetic justice and all that shit. Exactly. Which is why framing Maria Santos for this theft was perfect. It looked like the family curse continuing, and it eliminated someone who might eventually stumble onto the truth about the collection's origins. Victoria was crying silently beside Maria, tears streaming down her face as she listened to her husband casually discuss the calculated destruction of innocent lives across 3 generations. But now, Richard continued, I think someone has figured out the connection. The note, the questions being asked, my wife's sudden interest in family history, it all points to someone knowing more than they should. Then we accelerate the timeline, Marcelli said decisively. Forget waiting for the insurance money. We move the real jewelry tonight, destroy any evidence connecting us to the operation, and make sure anyone who knows too much forgets what they know. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we stage a break-in at your house tonight. We take whatever jewelry is still there. Make it look like a desperate follow-up theft by the Santos woman. And then we make sure she's not around to deny it. The casual discussion of murder made Maria's blood run cold. She fumbled with the recording equipment, desperate to ensure every word was being captured. When her elbow knocked against a piece of broken metal, the sound echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. Below them, both men froze, then slowly looked up toward the office windows where Maria and Victoria were hidden. Did you hear that? Marcelli's hand moved toward his jacket in a motion that suggested he was armed. Someone's in here, Richard said, his voice tight with fear. We need to go, Victoria whispered urgently, but Maria was already moving, grabbing the recording equipment and heading for the stairs they had used to reach the offices. Hey! Marcelli's voice boomed through the warehouse. Whoever's up there, you better come down real easy-like, or this is going to get messy real fast. Maria and Victoria ran through the abandoned offices, desperately seeking another way out. Behind them, they could hear heavy footsteps on the metal stairs, and Marcelli's voice shouting instructions to Richard about covering the exits. They found a fire escape on the building's far side, but the metal ladder was old and rusty. As they climbed down, Maria could hear Marcelli and Richard searching the offices above, their voices growing more agitated as they realized their conversation had been overheard. Did you get it all? Victoria gasped as they reached the ground. Everything, Maria confirmed, clutching the recorder like a lifeline. They made it to their car just as the warehouse's lights began flickering on. In the distance, Maria could see Henry emerging from his hiding spot, moving with surprising speed for a man his age toward the vehicle they had arranged to meet at. As they drove away from the industrial district, Maria's hands finally stopped shaking enough to properly examine the recording device. The digital display showed nearly an hour of recorded conversation, more than enough to prove the conspiracy between Richard and Marcelli. We did it, Victoria said, disbelief and exhaustion mingling in her voice. We actually have proof. We have proof of the insurance fraud and the conspiracy to frame me, Maria agreed. But we also have proof that they're planning to escalate things tonight. Victoria, you can't go home. If Richard thinks you're the leak, you're in danger. The reality of their situation was settling in. They had the evidence they needed to clear Maria's name and expose Richard's crimes, but they had also painted targets on their backs. Marcelli's casual discussion of eliminating problems permanently left no doubt about how far they were willing to go to protect their scheme. Where can we go? Victoria asked. Somewhere Richard would never think to look, Maria replied, already knowing the answer. My apartment in Queens. And tomorrow morning we take this recording to Detective Martinez and watch Richard's perfect crime fall apart. As they drove through the night toward Queens, Maria felt the weight of her great-grandmother's jewelry in her pocket, the pieces that had started this multi-generational saga of theft and injustice. Tomorrow, finally, the truth would come to light. The Santos women would have their vindication, and the Whitmore family's legacy of beautiful lies would crumble under the weight of recorded confessions. The jasmine might bloom beautifully in the estate's gardens, but tonight, justice smelled even sweeter. Detective Sarah Martinez's cramped office in the Queen's precinct had never felt more like a sanctuary. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Maria, Victoria, and Henry sat in mismatched chairs around Martinez's desk, the digital recorder placed in the center like evidence in a murder trial. Outside, the first pale light of dawn was creeping across the city, but none of them had slept. Let me get this straight, Detective Martinez said, rubbing her temples as she processed the night's revelations. You're telling me that Richard Whitmore orchestrated the theft of his own jewelry to collect insurance money, framed Maria Santos specifically because of her family's historical connection to the collection, and last night discussed escalating to murder to cover his tracks? That's exactly what we're telling you, Victoria replied, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her designer clothes were wrinkled from their warehouse adventure. But her spine remained straight with determination. Martinez picked up the recorder and rewound it to a specific section. Martelli's gravelly voice filled the small office. Forget waiting for the insurance money. We move the real jewelry tonight, destroy any evidence connecting us to the operation, and then we make sure she's not around to deny it. The threat against Mrs. Santos is explicit, Martinez noted, making detailed notes, and the conspiracy between Whitmore and Marcelli is clearly established. But I have to ask, how did you obtain this recording? Maria felt her stomach clench. They had known this question would come, and the answer could potentially invalidate the evidence. We followed them to a warehouse in Queens and recorded their conversation without their knowledge. That's illegal surveillance, Mrs. Santos. Any lawyer, worth his retainer, will argue this evidence is inadmissible. Detective, Henry spoke up, his weathered voice carrying decades of quiet authority. There's something else you need to know. Last night, while Maria and Mrs. Whitmore were at the warehouse, I went back to the estate. Richard and Marcelli weren't just talking about moving the jewelry, they actually did it. Martinez leaned forward. What do you mean? Daddy, I mean the real jewelry collection is gone from the Whitmore estate. Cleaned out completely. And the basement storage room where they kept it has been stripped bare. Whatever replicas Richard had made to replace the originals, he's removed those too. The implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. If Richard had already moved the stolen goods and eliminated the evidence, their recorded conversation might be the only proof of his crimes. There's more, Henry continued. I found this in the mansion's service hallway. He pulled out a small electronic device that looked like a hearing aid. It's a listening device. Richard has been bugging his own house, recording conversations between his staff and his wife. Victoria's face went white. That's how he knew what I was thinking, what questions I was asking. He's been spying on everyone. Martinez examined the device with growing interest. If we can prove this was used to illegally monitor conversations, it gives us grounds for a much broader investigation. Mrs. Whitmore, would you be willing to file a complaint about illegal surveillance in your own home? Absolutely. And detective, there's something else. My husband has been forging documents. Victoria pulled out papers they had discovered in the buried box. These insurance valuations are fraudulent. The jewelry was appraised at significantly less than the amounts he's claiming. The detective's phone rang, interrupting their discussion. After a brief conversation, she hung up with a grim expression. That was patrol. They found Richard Whitmore's Mercedes abandoned near JFK Airport. No sign of him or Marcelli. Maria felt her heart sink. They're running. Looks like it. Airport security is checking flight manifests, but if they used fake identities... Martinez didn't need to finish the thought. So what happens now? Victoria asked. Even if Richard has fled the country, what about Maria's case? What about clearing her name? Martinez was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence spread across her desk. Here's what I can do. The recorded conversation, despite how it was obtained, contains admissions of criminal conspiracy and threats against Mrs. Santos, combined with the financial documents you've provided and Mr. Castellanos' testimony about the surveillance equipment. I have enough to reopen the investigation and clear Mrs. Santos of all charges. Maria felt tears she had been holding back for weeks finally spill down her cheeks. You mean it's over? The criminal charges against you, yes. But Mrs. Santos, there's something you need to understand. Even though you're cleared, the damage to your reputation will take time to repair. The employment agencies that blacklisted you, the employers who refused to hire you, changing their minds, won't happen overnight. I don't care about overnight, Maria said firmly. I care about the truth finally being told. Victoria reached over and took Maria's hand. Maria, I want to offer you your job back. More than that, I want to offer you a position as estate manager, with full authority over the household staff and a salary that reflects your real value. The offer was generous, but Maria found herself hesitating. Working at the Whitmore estate again, after everything that had happened, felt like stepping back into a life that no longer fit. Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate the offer, more than you know. But I think it's time for me to try something different. What do you mean? Maria had been thinking about this during the long, sleepless night. I want to start my own domestic services company. Not just cleaning, but comprehensive household management for people who need trustworthy help. And I want to specialize in helping families who've been treated badly by previous employers. The idea had been forming in her mind for weeks, crystallizing as she realized how many people in her position had no recourse when wealthy employers decided to destroy their lives. A business that focused on protecting workers' rights while providing excellent service could fill a real need in the market. That's a wonderful idea, Victoria said warmly. And I'd like to be your first client. The estate will need management, whether Richard returns or not. Detective Martinez cleared her throat. Before you make any business plans, there's one more thing we need to discuss. The insurance company is going to want their money back. And they're going to come after the Whitmore assets to get it. Mrs. Whitmore, you may find yourself in a very difficult financial position. Victoria nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that. Richard's debts, his crimes, the insurance fraud, it's all going to come out. But, Detective, there's something I want to do first. She turned to Maria with an expression of fierce determination. The jewelry collection that was stolen. The pieces that originally belonged to your family. I want to make sure they're returned to you legally. Even if we never recover the actual items, I want the historical record corrected. Mrs. Whitmore, you don't have to... Yes, I do. My family built their wealth partly on stolen goods. My great-grandfather took advantage of desperate people, and when your grandmother tried to return what was rightfully yours, my grandfather destroyed her life to cover it up. It's time to make that right. Henry, who had been quiet throughout this exchange, suddenly straightened in his chair. There's something else you should know. Something I haven't told anyone for 40 years. Everyone turned to look at him, and Maria saw something in his weathered face that made her pulse quicken. Eleanor didn't just take 3 pieces of jewelry when she left the estate. Margaret Whitmore gave her something else, a letter written in Margaret's own hand, confessing the truth about how the collection was acquired and authorizing Elena to return the stolen pieces to their rightful owners. The office fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of morning. Traffic. Where is this letter? Martinez asked. Elena gave it to my father for safekeeping, along with the jewelry. When my father died, he passed both to me with instructions to return them to Elena's family when the time was right. Henry looked directly at Maria. I still have Margaret Whitmore's letter, Mija, hidden in my cottage for all these years. Maria felt the room spinning around her. A written confession from Margaret Whitmore, documenting the theft of her family's jewelry and authorizing its return, would be ironclad proof of the collection's true ownership. Henry, why didn't you tell me this before? The old man's eyes filled with tears. Because I was afraid. Your grandmother was branded as a thief for trying to tell the truth. I was just a young gardener then, with no power, no voice that anyone would listen to. I told myself I was protecting the letter until the time was right, but really, I was just protecting myself. Victoria stood up slowly, her face pale but resolute. Mr. Castellanos, with your permission, I'd like that letter to be made part of the official record. And I'd like to work with Maria to establish a legal foundation that will research and return other stolen cultural artifacts to their rightful owners. What are you saying? Maria asked. I'm saying we're going to turn this tragedy into something positive. We're going to create an organization that helps families like yours reclaim what was stolen from them. And we're going to make sure that what happened to your grandmother and to you never happens to anyone else. Detective Martinez leaned back in her chair, a slight smile crossing her tired features. You know, in 20 years of police work, I've seen a lot of cases where the victim gets justice but never gets their life back. This might be the first time I've seen the victim get both. As the morning sun climbed higher over Queens, casting golden light through the precinct's grimy windows, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in months, hope for the future. Not just hope for her own vindication, but hope that her family's long struggle for justice would finally result in something larger than personal victory. The jasmine might have bloomed in gardens built on stolen wealth, but from those same gardens, something new and honest was about to grow. 6 months later, the converted brownstone in Brooklyn Heights buzzed with purposeful activity. The brass nameplate by the entrance read Heritage Justice Foundation, restoring truth, reclaiming legacy. Inside, Maria Santos moved through the offices with the confident stride of a woman who had found her calling. The foundation occupied 3 floors of the renovated building with research facilities, legal offices, and a community meeting space where families could share their stories in safety and dignity. Mrs. Santos, the reporter from the Times, is here for the interview, called Jessica Chen, a recent law school graduate who had joined the foundation as their first full-time legal advocate. Her enthusiasm reminded Maria of Miguel, who was now thriving in his freshman year at Columbia University, his tuition covered by an anonymous scholarship that everyone suspected came from Victoria. The New York Times interview was part of a growing media attention surrounding the foundation's work. In just 6 months, they had identified and begun investigating over 40 cases of cultural artifacts and family. Heirlooms that had been acquired, under questionable circumstances, by wealthy collectors. The story of Maria's vindication and the subsequent revelation about the Whitmore jewelry had opened floodgates of similar stories from families across the immigrant communities of New York. "Send her up to my office," Maria replied, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the desperate housekeeper who had been accused of theft less than a year ago. Her hair was professionally styled. Her tailored business suit spoke of success and authority, and most importantly, her eyes held the confidence of someone who had fought for justice and won. The reporter, Amanda Foster, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who specialized in investigative pieces about social justice. She settled into the comfortable chair across from Maria's desk, her recorder placed between them with careful precision. "Mrs. Santos, when we spoke 6 months ago during the initial coverage of your case, you were still fighting to clear your name. Now you're running a foundation that's recovered over $2 million worth of stolen cultural artifacts. How does it feel to have turned your personal tragedy into a force for justice? Maria considered the question carefully. It feels like my grandmother's struggle finally has meaning. Elena Santos died believing she was a thief in the eyes of the world. Now not only has her name been cleared, but her story is helping other families reclaim what was stolen from them. Let's talk about some of your specific successes. The Hernandez family's silver collection, for instance. The Hernandez case was particularly gratifying, Maria said, her voice warming. Their great-grandfather was a silversmith in Mexico City, whose workshop was raided during the Revolution. The family lost everything and fled to the United States with nothing. Last month, we were able to prove that a collection valued at over $300,000 in a Manhattan museum had been stolen from their workshop. The museum has agreed to return the pieces and is working with us to research the provenance of other items in their collection. And this all started with your own family's stolen jewelry. It did. Margaret Whitmore's letter, which Henry Castellanos preserved for 40 years, didn't just prove that my great-grandmother's jewelry had been stolen. It included details about other families who had been victims of similar thefts. That letter became our roadmap for the first dozen cases we investigated. Amanda Foster made notes as she listened. What happened to Richard Whitmore? There were reports that he fled the country. Maria's expression hardened slightly. Richard and Tony Marcelli were arrested 3 months ago in the Cayman Islands, trying to liquidate stolen goods through black market dealers. They're both facing federal charges for insurance fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Richard's trial is scheduled for next year. And Victoria Whitmore. She's become your primary financial backer, I understand. Victoria is my partner in this work, Maria said firmly. She could have simply written a check and walked away, but instead, she's dedicated herself to making amends for her family's past. She's our primary researcher, and she's donated the entire Whitmore estate to the foundation as our permanent headquarters. The interview continued for another hour, covering the foundation's methodology for researching stolen artifacts, their partnerships with museums and universities, and their growing network of volunteer investigators from immigrant communities across the city. When Amanda Foster finally packed up her equipment, Maria felt confident that the article would help spread awareness of their work to families who might not know they had legal recourse for historical injustices. After the reporter left, Maria walked through the Foundation's offices, checking on the various projects in progress. In the research department, Victoria was hunched over a computer, cross-referencing auction house records with immigration documents from the early 1900s. Her transformation had been as dramatic as Maria's. The polished socialite had evolved into a determined advocate, her intimate knowledge of how wealthy families operated, making her invaluable in tracking stolen goods through high society networks. Any luck with the Rosenberg case? Maria asked, looking over Victoria's shoulder at the screen filled with genealogical charts and property records. Getting close, Victoria replied without looking up. I found 3 pieces from their grandmother's collection in auction records from the 1950s. Same dealer who handled some of Richard's transactions. If we can prove the chain of custody, the Rosenbergs will get their family's Sabbath silver back. In the legal department, Jessica Chen was on the phone with a museum curator in Boston, her voice patient but firm, as she explained why the Foundation believed certain items in their collection had been stolen from Filipino families during the American colonial period. No, sir, we're not making accusations without evidence, Jessica was saying. We have documentation showing that these ceremonial objects were taken during military raids and sold to private collectors who later donated them to your museum. We're simply asking for your cooperation in returning them to the descendants of their rightful owners. The community meeting room was preparing for the evening support group, a gathering of families who were navigating the emotional and legal complexities of reclaiming stolen heritage. Maria had learned that the psychological impact of historical theft was often as devastating as the financial loss. Families carried guilt and shame across generations, believing their ancestors had somehow failed to protect precious heirlooms that were actually stolen through violence or fraud. As evening approached, Maria found herself in the Foundation's small kitchen, preparing coffee for the support group meeting. The ritual reminded her of her days at the Whitmore estate, but now the similarity felt empowering rather than painful. She was still taking care of people, still ensuring that others felt welcome and valued, but now she was doing it as an equal partner rather than a servant. "Mom," Miguel's voice called from the reception area. He had taken a part-time job at the Foundation, helping with research and translation services while maintaining his full course load at Columbia. "In here, Mijo," she called back. Miguel appeared in the doorway, his face bright with excitement. "Mom, you need to see this. Henry found something." They walked together to Henry's corner office, where the elderly man spent his days organizing the Foundation's growing archive of historical documents. At 73, Henry had found new purpose in his role as the Foundation's chief archivist. His decades of silent observation finally being channeled into active advocacy for justice. "Maria, look at this," Henry said, his voice trembling with emotion. He held up a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "I found this in the Foundation's basement, in a box of documents that Victoria donated from the estate's storage." "What is it?" "It's Richard Whitmore II's personal diary from 1952, the year your grandmother was fired." Henry opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon. "Listen to this entry, dated 3 days after Elena left the estate." Henry began to read in a voice thick with emotion. "The Santos matter has been resolved, though I find no satisfaction in the outcome. Elena was innocent of theft, as I suspected all along. She was merely carrying out Margaret's final wishes regarding the return of certain items to their rightful owners. But the insurance claim has already been filed, and admitting the truth now would expose the questionable origins of much of our collection. I have chosen to protect the family's reputation at the cost of an innocent woman's. God forgive me for this decision." The room fell silent as the full impact of the confession sank in. Here was written proof that Richard II had known Elena was innocent, had known she was trying to return stolen goods to their rightful owners, and had chosen to destroy her life anyway to protect his family's secrets. "There's more," Henry continued, turning pages carefully. He kept detailed records of every piece in the collection, including notes about which items had been acquired through irregular circumstances during his father's business dealings in the Caribbean. Victoria appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of voices. When she saw the journal, her face went pale. "More family secrets?" "More than secrets," Maria said softly. "This is proof that your family knew they were perpetuating an injustice, and it's proof that there are dozens more families like mine who deserve to have their heritage returned." Miguel whistled low as he looked at the list of questionable acquisitions. "Mom, this could triple the number of cases we can investigate." "It's not just about the cases," Maria replied, taking the journal from Henry with reverent care. "It's about the truth. For 70 years, my family carried the shame of being branded as thieves. Now we have absolute proof that we were the victims, not the criminals." As the support group members began arriving for their evening meeting, Maria found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a struggling single mother, cleaning other people's homes and dreaming of a better future for her son. The theft of the Whitmore jewelry had nearly destroyed her life. But it had also set in motion a chain of events that revealed a much larger injustice and gave her the tools to fight it. The families gathering in the meeting room that evening represented dozens of cultures and countless stories of loss and hope. There was Mrs. Kowalski, whose grandmother's Polish folk art had been acquired by American soldiers during World War II. The Nguyen family was fighting to reclaim Vietnamese jade sculptures that had disappeared during the fall of Saigon. The Patels were researching the whereabouts of Indian textiles that had been sold by British colonial administrators. Each family's story was unique, but they all shared common threads: heritage stolen during times of crisis, powerful people taking advantage of the powerless, and generations of families carrying shame for losses that weren't their fault. "Before we begin tonight's meeting," Maria said as the group settled into their chairs, "I want to share something we discovered today that reminds us why this work is so important." She told them about Richard II's journal, about his written admission of Elena's innocence and his detailed documentation of other thefts. As she spoke, she saw recognition and validation spreading across the faces in the room, the same expression she had seen in her own mirror when Detective Martinez first told her that the charges against her were being dropped. "What happened to my grandmother wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding," Maria continued. "It was a deliberate choice by powerful people to protect their secrets at the expense of an innocent woman's life. But that choice, documented in their own words, is now the key to helping all of us reclaim what was stolen." As the meeting progressed, with families sharing updates on their cases and offering support for each other's struggles, Maria felt the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. The jasmine that had once bloomed in the Whitmore Gardens had been beautiful, but built on lies. The justice growing in this room was harder won and more complex, but it was real and honest and permanent. Outside the brownstone's windows, the lights of Manhattan twinkled across the East River. Somewhere in that glittering city were museums, private collections, and auction houses holding thousands of items that belonged to families like the ones gathered in this room. The work of finding them and returning them would take years, maybe decades. But Maria Santos had learned that justice was like jasmine. It might take time to bloom, but once it took root, it was surprisingly resilient. And unlike flowers that bloomed and faded with the seasons, the truth had a way of growing stronger with each passing year. 2 years after that first devastating night when Victoria Whitmore's jewelry vanished, Maria Santos stood in the marble hallway of what had once been the Whitmore estate, now the permanent headquarters of the Heritage Justice Foundation. The grand staircase, where she had once been escorted out in disgrace, now led to offices where her legal team worked to restore stolen heritage to families across the nation. The afternoon sunlight, streaming through the tall windows, caught the brass nameplate she had installed where the family portraits once hung, in memory of Elena Santos Rivera and all those whose truth was silenced by power. The transformation of the estate had been Victoria's idea, but Maria's vision had guided every detail. The opulent master bedroom was now a research library. The dining room where wealthy donors had once gathered for charity galas now hosted community meetings where immigrant families shared their stories in a dozen different languages. The blue room, where Maria had once dusted family photographs with such care, had become a meditation space where people could process the emotional weight of reclaiming stolen heritage. "Maria, they're ready for you in the conference room," called Dr. Sarah Kim, the Foundation's Director of Research. Sarah had joined them 6 months earlier after completing her PhD in art history, her dissertation focusing on the colonial theft of Korean cultural artifacts. The conference room was packed with an unusual assembly: reporters, federal prosecutors, museum directors, and families whose cases the Foundation had championed. At the center of the table sat a familiar figure who made Maria's heart race with a mixture of satisfaction and residual anger: Richard Whitmore III, flanked by federal marshals and wearing the orange jumpsuit of a convicted felon. Richard had aged dramatically during his 2 years of legal battles. His once perfect silver hair was now completely white, his expensive suits replaced by prison uniforms, and his arrogant confidence had crumbled into the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man who had lost everything. The federal conviction for insurance fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering had resulted in a 12-year sentence. But today, he was here for a different kind of reckoning. "Mr. Whitmore," said federal prosecutor Janet Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman who had built her career on white-collar crime cases, "as part of your plea agreement, you've agreed to provide complete disclosure about stolen cultural artifacts that passed through your family's collection. Are you prepared to fulfill that commitment today?" Richard nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. "I am." Maria had mixed feelings about this moment. Part of her wanted to savor Richard's downfall, to feel vindicated by seeing the man who had tried to destroy her life now broken and imprisoned. But the larger part of her, the part that had been shaped by 2 years of helping other families heal from similar traumas, felt only sadness for the waste of it all. "Let's begin with the Santos family jewelry," Prosecutor Morrison continued. "Please describe how those pieces came into your great-grandfather's possession." Richard's hands trembled as he opened a folder containing documents his legal team had prepared. "In 1898, my great-grandfather Richard Whitmore, I was involved in sugar plantation investments in Puerto Rico following the Spanish-American War. He took advantage of families who were displaced by the political upheaval to acquire valuable personal property for far below its actual worth." Specifically regarding the Rivera family collection? The Rivera family owned a jewelry business in San Juan. When they fled the island during the transition period, my great-grandfather claimed their abandoned property under territorial laws that were questionable at best. He paid the territorial government a nominal fee and took possession of jewelry worth thousands of times more than what he paid. Victoria, sitting beside Maria, closed her eyes as if the words physically hurt her. She had spent 2 years coming to terms with her family's legacy, but hearing the details spoken aloud still caused her visible pain. And when Elena Santos attempted to return these items to their rightful owners in 1952, my grandfather knew the jewelry had been stolen, but admitting it would have exposed our family to legal liability and social disgrace. He chose to frame Elena for theft rather than acknowledge the truth. Richard's voice broke slightly. "The same choice I made 50 years later with her great-granddaughter." Dr. Kim leaned forward from her position at the table. "Mr. Whitmore, our research has identified over 200 pieces that your family acquired through similar circumstances. Are you prepared to provide documentation for all of these items?" "I am. My legal team has prepared a complete inventory, including purchase records, insurance documentation, and my great-grandfather's personal correspondence describing how the items were obtained." The next 3 hours revealed the staggering scope of the Whitmore family's acquisitions. Filipino goldwork taken during the American colonial period. Native American ceremonial objects acquired through fraudulent treaties. African sculptures bought from Belgian dealers who had looted them during the Congo's colonial exploitation. Chinese jade pieces that had disappeared from Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion. Each revelation brought gasps from the families present, many of whom had spent decades searching for cultural artifacts they thought were lost forever. Maria watched their faces transform from skepticism to hope to joy as Richard confirmed the existence and current locations of items their grandparents had described, in stories that everyone had assumed were just nostalgic family myths. "Mrs. Santos," Prosecutor Morrison said as the formal testimony concluded, "would you like to make a statement for the record?" Maria stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. Behind her, portraits of Heritage Justice Foundation success stories lined the walls. Dozens of families who had reclaimed stolen heritage, museums that had voluntarily returned looted artifacts, and legal precedents that would protect future generations from similar thefts. 2 years ago, I was accused of stealing jewelry that had belonged to my own family for generations. The accusation nearly destroyed my life, my relationship with my son, and my faith in justice. But it also led to the discovery of a much larger truth, that powerful people have been stealing from vulnerable communities for centuries, and that their victims have been carrying shame for crimes they didn't commit. She paused, looking directly at Richard. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't forgive you for what you tried to do to me. But I thank you, because your crimes led to the exposure of much older crimes, and that exposure has allowed dozens of families to reclaim what was stolen from them." Turning to address the room more broadly, Maria continued with growing passion. The Heritage Justice Foundation has now recovered over $8 million worth of stolen cultural artifacts. We've helped 47 families reclaim their heritage. We've established legal precedents that will make it easier for future victims to seek justice. And we've shown that the truth, no matter how long it's been buried, eventually finds its way to the light. Miguel, now in his junior year at Columbia and working part-time as the Foundation's coordinator of youth programs, stood up from his seat in the gallery. "I want to add something to what my mother said. 2 years ago, I doubted her innocence. That doubt will always be one of my deepest regrets. But watching her transform personal injustice into a force for healing has taught me that the measure of a person isn't whether they fall down, it's what they choose to build when they get back up." The press conference that followed generated national coverage. But Maria barely paid attention to the cameras and questions. She was thinking about Elena Santos Rivera, the grandmother she had barely known, whose reputation had finally been restored, not just within their family, but in the historical record. The Foundation's research had uncovered Elena's obituary in a Puerto Rican newspaper, which described her as a woman of unshakable integrity who served wealthy families in New York with dedication and honesty. Even in death, Elena had been vindicated by people who knew her true character. As the media and officials departed, Maria found herself alone in the estate's gardens with Victoria and Henry. The jasmine vines were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the evening air with sweetness that no longer carried the bitter undertone of hidden secrets. "Do you ever regret it?" Victoria asked quietly. "Giving up the quiet life you had before all this started?" Maria considered the question seriously. "I regret the pain it caused Miguel and me. I regret the months of uncertainty and fear. But regret the outcome? Never. Elena spent 60 years branded as a thief. Now she's remembered as a hero who tried to return stolen goods to their rightful owners. That's worth every moment of struggle." Henry, now 75 and serving as the Foundation's senior advisor, picked a jasmine bloom and held it up to catch the last rays of sunlight. "You know what I think when I smell these flowers now? I think about how beautiful things can grow from soil that holds painful secrets. But they're even more beautiful when those secrets are finally brought into the light." "Speaking of light," Victoria said with a smile, "I have something to show you both." She led them to the estate's main entrance, where workers were installing a new bronze plaque beside the Heritage Justice Foundation nameplate. The inscription read, "Dedicated to Elena Santos Rivera, 1915-1987, Margaret Whitmore, 1920-1952, and all those who chose truth over comfort, justice over silence, and courage over safety." "Margaret?" Maria asked, surprised to see the name of Richard's grandmother included in the memorial. "She tried to right the wrongs her family had committed," Victoria explained. "That letter she wrote authorizing the return of stolen jewelry was an act of courage that cost her everything. She deserves to be remembered alongside your grandmother as someone who fought for justice." As darkness settled over the gardens and the lights came on in the Foundation's offices, Maria felt the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new families seeking help to reclaim stolen heritage, new challenges in navigating the complex intersection of law, history, and justice. But tonight, In the garden, where her grandmother had once tended to another woman's flowers while carrying the burden of false accusations, Maria Santos stood as the director of an organization that had helped dozens of families reclaim what was rightfully theirs. The jasmine bloomed around them, no longer hiding secrets, but celebrating the truth that had finally set multiple generations free. Miguel joined them in the garden, carrying a small velvet box that Maria recognized immediately. Inside were the 3 pieces of jewelry that had started this entire journey: the sapphire necklace, the emerald earrings, and the diamond bracelet that Henry had kept safe for over 70 years. "I thought it was time," Miguel said simply, fastening the sapphire necklace around his mother's neck. Great-great-grandmother Isabel's jewelry should be worn by her great-great-granddaughter. The stones caught the garden lights and seemed to glow with their own inner fire. Not just beautiful gems, but symbols of a family's resilience across 4 generations of women who had faced injustice with courage and determination. As they walked back toward the mansion that was now truly their own, Maria felt the weight of her ancestors' struggles lifting from her shoulders. Elena Santos Rivera could finally rest in peace, her name cleared, and her great-granddaughter carrying on the fight for justice that she had begun. The Heritage Justice Foundation would continue its work, helping families reclaim what had been stolen and ensuring that the powerful could no longer destroy the powerless with impunity. And somewhere in the Puerto Rican soil where Elena was buried, and in the hearts of families across America who were finally able to hold their ancestors' treasures once again, the seeds of justice that had been planted in sorrow were blooming into something beautiful and permanent. The jasmine would continue to bloom in these gardens, but now its fragrance carried only sweetness, the scent of truth triumphant, justice served, and love that transcended the boundaries of life and death to heal the wounds of the past. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you watched until here, comment "I watched until here," and leave your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen for you. It's very exciting.